Although the weather and the sea was always warmer in her native Italy, Daniela was determined that her Welsh holiday should include her favourite pastime, windsurfing. She and her TV producer boyfriend, Rocco, had taken a short break in Wales before starting work on Rocco's latest production, a film that was to star Daniela. After seeing her safely off, Rocco was content to let her windsurf while he pressed on with some urgent work that needed to be completed. Daniela found the cold bracing, but there were side effects. Down her right leg, she experienced the first twinges of cramp. Flexing her feet, she tried to fight it, but it had taken a firm, vice-like grip of her calf muscle. Suddenly, everything changed. The sea didn't look inviting anymore. Losing control of the board, she fell headlong into the water. Panic struck. She cried to Rocco for help, but as always, he was too interested in his mobile phone to notice the crisis. Would no one hear? Would no one notice? She suddenly felt afraid. Why was Rocco never there when she needed him? With her leg in agony, she clambered onto the board and shouted again, only to see Rocco disappearing towards the hotel. Why didn't he even bother to keep an eye on her from time to time? This was so typical. Across the bay, however, Michael, out for a quiet day's fishing, had suddenly become aware of the cries shattering the silence of the morning. This was where Michael was at his best. It was an intrinsic part of his nature to put other people first. He knew these waters like the back of his hand, and knew that although it might appear calm, the sea could be extremely treacherous in these parts. At one point, the undercurrents were so strong, you could easily be swept out to sea. Feeling the pull of those powerful arms around her, Daniela began to feel safe at last. She was still in a state of shock, however, and in great pain. But Michael was there to reassure and help. Having sorted out his business problems for the time being, Rocco's thoughts turned to Daniela. Seeing her with another man, he totally misread the situation. As he was about to confront her, Daniela explained to him what had happened. Michael had probably saved her life. Rocco, somewhat embarrassed by his action, offered to repay Michael the only way he knew, with money. It was Daniela's turn to feel embarrassed. She thought how different these two were. One assertive and flashy, the other quiet and gentle. And Michael, feeling he had to see her again, invited the two of them around to his cottage that evening for a meal. He'd caught some fish earlier and would love to share it with them. Daniela gratefully accepted, for the two of them. The evening was particularly pleasant and balmy as Daniela and Rocco arrived at Michael's cottage. Daniela immediately felt at home. Although Italian herself, her grandfather was a Welshman, a sailor, who had married her grandmother and settled in Italy. Daniela had always yearned to visit the land of her forefathers. To her, this was almost a pilgrimage. Looking at Michael, she could understand now why she'd felt different from the others as a child. She felt a tremendous affinity with him. But Rocco's mind was in overdrive. Always an opportunist, he thought that the incident with the surfboard could be exploited for publicity. Local fisherman saves TV star. It was definitely front-page material. But in her heart of hearts, Daniela knew that Rocco's crass and opportunistic approach would not appeal to Michael's calm and sensitive nature. But Rocco persisted. He was like a dog with a bone. He refused to back down. Two men with totally contrasting attitudes. One happy in the limelight, and the other content in the background. Michael couldn't take his eyes off Daniela. To him, she was the most beautiful girl in the world. Those sincere, sparkling brown eyes made him feel more than a twinge of jealousy. But he knew that Daniela was spoken for. Sensing that Michael was slightly upset by Rocco's suggestions, Daniela followed him into the cottage. She was entranced by what she saw. As she listened to the sound of the sea in the shell, she felt warm and comfortable. Was this the same sound her grandfather had heard all those years ago, dreaming of his homeland? Looking into Michael's eyes, she completely understood his quiet reticence, and she was more than a little surprised to find herself taking his side. She appealed to Rocco not to persist with his plan. She understood that he was trying to do his best for her career. But it would be a pity if he were to spoil this warm summer evening. To ease the obvious tension and to change the subject, Michael was about to make a suggestion, but it became apparent that for the time being, Rocco had decided to let things be. Toasting Michael with champagne and thanking him for saving his girlfriend's life, Rocco suggested they could all go fishing the next day. Michael readily agreed, because it meant that he could see Daniela again. As they were leaving, he thought he caught in her eye the same flicker of anticipation as he felt about the following day. Could it be? Or was he dreaming? Sensing that Daniela was a little subdued, Rocco felt this was not the appropriate moment to pursue his plan. But pursue it he would, the following morning. I wonder if they really will come fishing with me today, Michael thought, as he prepared for another day that he believed might be less eventful than yesterday. Although he was pleased, he was also somewhat surprised when he saw the two of them approaching down the beach. He warmed inside at the prospect of being in Daniela's company once again, and Rocco was fine, a little conceited maybe, but tolerable. He wasn't really suitably dressed to spend a day on a fishing boat, though, and Michael thought he ought to tell him so. But Rocco explained he wouldn't be coming. He needed to go into the nearest town to find a fax machine to send some notes to his TV company in Rome. Daniela would accompany Michael on her own if he didn't mind. Didn't mind. But Rocco was a little more cunning than he let on. He thought that by allowing Daniela to accompany Michael alone, she might persuade him to change his mind and to go along with his publicity gimmick. But as soon as they were skimming the waves, enjoying the bracing morning air and the wonderful scenery, Rocco and his cunning plan were soon forgotten. She really is beautiful, Michael thought. He liked the way she responded as he pointed out to her the interesting rocks and coves with their wealth of wildlife. Michael hoped that he'd not betrayed too easily, especially to Rocco, his delight at the thought of having Daniela all to himself for a while. What did it matter now, anyway? For the next few hours, she was to be with him. If he had impressed her by saving her from the cold sea, today he might be able to create an even more favorable impression. And then, well, who knows? But he couldn't allow himself to think along these lines, and they settled down to do some fishing, although Michael was very doubtful whether any serious fishing would take place today. And he was more surprised than her that it was Daniela who pulled in the first catch of the day. He gladly leapt to her aid, a wonderful excuse to be near her. The warmth of her body and the scent of her perfume filled him with excitement. He sensed that she also enjoyed the body contact. Michael could feel his heart racing. But then something snapped. Yes, it was the famous Italian temperament. "Put it back," she yelled. A fisherman throwing back a weighty catch, unheard of. But she was insistent, and he wanted to please her, and so back it went. What a sensitive woman, Michael thought. He didn't want to upset her, so he slowly pulled up the anchor, hoping that this little incident would soon be forgotten, and that maybe they could spend some time together the next day. Daniela said she'd be delighted. Rocco, no doubt, would have some other plans to keep himself occupied. He was just so boring at times, but she owed him so much and just put up with his whims. But the plans that Rocco had were rather more extreme than anything Daniela had anticipated. They had to cut short their holiday and return to Rome on the next available flight. There were far too many problems with his forthcoming production, and he just had to return to Italy immediately. They'd get a flight from Cardiff to Amsterdam, and there'd be plenty of connecting flights from there to Rome. And so they had to say their goodbyes. Although she protested, Daniela tried not to show her disappointment. She was sorry to cut short her holiday, but more sorry to be leaving Michael. Typical of his life, he thought. Some you catch, some you don't. And she, gone forever. Even though the sun was shining, Michael's spirits were at an ebb. As he looked out on the calm sea, he found it difficult to believe that he would never see Daniela's face again. Suddenly, he heard the sound of a car approaching. It was their car. They hadn't gone after all. Then he realized that Daniela was alone. He raced to meet her. Daniela excitedly explained that Rocco had been unable to book them both on the same flight, so they had one more day entirely to themselves. This was beyond Michael's wildest dreams. Holding her firmly by the hand, he led her down to the water's edge. Deep inside, he knew that this was going to be a memorable day. No one, not even Rocco, with all his cunning tricks, could break this spell. Gazing into each other's eyes, they both knew it felt so right, so natural to be together. Deciding that they'd have a meal at the cottage, they began collecting driftwood to make a fire. Daniela offered to cook something for him this time, something Italian. As Daniela made ready in the kitchen, Michael prepared the fire. All the ingredients were in the larder. This would be a meal to remember. However, all her theatrical skills had not prepared Daniela for this encounter with a primitive tin opener. Michael, as always, came to the rescue. They looked, often, into each other's eyes. Somehow, even peeling the onions seemed a less daunting task today, with Daniela around to wipe away his tears. Then came the moment of truth. Initially, he teased her. But then he relented and announced the meal a resounding success. There was a warm, homely atmosphere as they sat down to enjoy the meal. And red wine and pasta completed the feeling of warmth between them. "The dishes can wait," said Michael. "Let's relax for a while." Suddenly, Daniela felt complete. That day, everything had been perfect. And then... it was bound to happen. Now, there was no holding back. The following morning was bittersweet. For Michael, this was one of the happiest mornings of his life. But as he gazed into Daniela's eyes, he detected a certain sadness. This was not to be. It was time to go. Wanting to remain with her as long as possible, he offered to drive her to the airport. That way, he would at least have a few more hours in her company. Few words were spoken during the journey. They were both locked into their own thoughts. For Michael, the moment had arrived all too soon. The routine of a busy airport meant there was precious little time even to talk. Back at the beach, with its all-embracing tranquility, Michael was the master of his own domain. But here, amongst the hubbub and bustle, he felt powerless and defenseless. Having checked in, there was enough time for a quick coffee. This was his chance. He decided to relate to her his true feelings. Would she stay with him? The last 4 days had meant much more to him than even he had realized. It had also meant a lot to her, but she couldn't just leave Rocco like that, after all he'd done for her. He would never forget her, said Michael, as he handed her a memento. Then her flight was called. Now it really was time to say goodbye. Parting is such sweet sorrow. Michael willed her not to go. And then she was gone. Michael was devastated. As she crossed the tarmac towards the plane, Daniela's thoughts were in a turmoil. Desperate to catch one last glimpse of her before she disappeared out of his life forever, Michael rushed to the observation tower. He would have given his all to make her change her mind. But quick as a flash, Daniela had decided she just couldn't leave. Michael read her mind. His prayers had been answered. Rushing towards each other, they both knew that nothing, no one, nor any barrier could now stand in their way.
They'd arranged to meet at a new wine bar. It had been Sarah's suggestion. 8 years they'd known each other. Sarah had come a long way since then. Mortgage, husband, and 2 kids. Whereas Rosie, well, Rosie was pretty much unchanged. She didn't look a day older than when they'd first met at college. Sarah smiled at the memory. Rosie was habitually late, and romance was still eluding her grasp. "I've done my bit," Sarah frequently told her. "After all, you caught my bouquet." Rosie just laughed. Inside the wine bar, Sarah was impressed. It had an airy, spacious feel, just right for a summer's evening. And the staff were attentive. Good looking, too. As she walked to a table, Sarah wondered just how late Rosie would be this time, and she smiled to herself. 3 minutes late. Well, that wasn't bad considering the traffic. Sarah wouldn't mind. Sarah knew how lucky she was with Richard and the boys. Rosie was a copywriter with an advertising agency. She was happy with her job, her home, and her friends. But Sarah knew she could be happier still with the right man. Sarah soon steered the conversation round to her favourite subject, the men in Rosie's life, or lack of them. "What do you mean you don't meet anyone?" she demanded. "What about him?" Rosie turned to follow her gaze. She just didn't meet people like him. Married people didn't understand. As he cleared their table, Rosie took in the essential details. Tall, blondish, nice smile, nice eyes, nice smiling eyes. Sarah, enjoying herself, was quite at ease and quite smitten with him herself by the sound of it. Sarah was convinced he was just the sort of guy Rosie should be looking for. And Rosie had to admit he had a certain charm. Of course, as far as Sarah was concerned, that was as good as a proposal. She suggested that they came back to the same place next week. Rosie agreed. But her voice trailed off as she followed Sarah's glance. As they left, Rosie wondered why she felt so deflated. It was his job to be nice to people, but not the same person for the whole evening. Rosie was still rather subdued as she made her coffee, but Sarah was planning for next week. She suggested they went to see a film before calling at the wine bar. Rosie didn't see why not. She didn't want to spend the whole evening in the wine bar watching that guy chatting up another blonde. But Sarah's attention had been distracted. She was wondering who wrote these lonely heart ads. Were they real? Professional male, early 30s, seeks fun-loving lady, 25 to 35. Witty, interesting. Probably looks like Woody Allen collects dinky toys. They decided you had to do a certain amount of reading between the lines. Soon enough, Sarah had to go. After they'd said goodnight, Rosie thought about it. Did she really not meet eligible men, or was she getting too choosy in her old age? And it wasn't as if she relished being on her own. Soon, Sarah would be home, not going into a dark house as Rosie did after a night out, but home to one which was warm and light, with the boys' football gear in the hall and their socks on the stairs, and a husband waiting up for her. It was all very well joking about these lonely hearts ads, but at least they were doing something about their lives. Who was it who said, if you can't beat 'em, join 'em? Why shouldn't she put her own ad in? After all, what had she got to lose? But how do you put a dream down in 5 lines? All the copywriting experience in the world couldn't help her. And this could be the most important sales pitch she'd ever written. As she approached her local shop a week later, Rosie wondered if anything about her gave away how terrified she was feeling. She hoped not. After all, what was sinister in buying a listings magazine? Even if it might contain her own Lonely Hearts ad. She congratulated herself on managing to pay for it without dropping the money. Denying herself her usual chocolate bar and a dose of gossip from behind the counter, she hurried outside. Had they printed it? She turned straight to the back page. There it was in black and white. There was no backing out now. By the time she met Sarah that evening, after a quick look at the shops, her mood had changed. In fact, she was rather proud of herself. When she told Sarah about the ad, she had the satisfaction of seeing Sarah's mouth literally drop open. Rosie, you haven't. Then it was all questions. When? Where? How? And is it safe? Rosie started to explain about the box number, which would protect her from any undesirables. But she was interrupted. There he was again with his charm, his sales patter. Still those nice smiling eyes. Trouble was, they smiled at everybody, and Rosie wanted someone whose eyes would smile for her alone. She might not have long to wait. And who better to help her sift through the replies than Sarah? She had such definite ideas about the procedure, Rosie began to wonder if she'd done this sort of thing before. She suggested they made 3 piles: no-nos, possibilities, and highly likelies. Rosie could only agree. Sarah passed her the first, but Rosie wasn't keen on moustaches. The next one had a bit of Richard Gere about him, in a good light. But would he spend more time in the bathroom than she did? then an intriguing possibility. Nice letter, nice writing, but no photo. Had to be a definite possibility. Rosie thought the next one was a bit young, but on consideration, why shouldn't she have a toy boy? He was a possibility then. Sarah was really getting into this now. How about someone older, she offered. Well, he might have cut his wife off the picture, protested Rosie. No thanks. It wasn't an easy task. It's hard to judge someone on the basis of a letter and a 5-year-old holiday snapshot. There was no one Rosie really warmed to. But there was one letter they came back to, the one without the photograph. The paper was thick and it was even written in real fountain pen. He wrote that he couldn't bear having his photo taken, so had an enclosed one. But I hope you'll believe me when I say I haven't got 2 heads and I'm considered attractive. Well, that's what my mum says anyway, the letter went on. Sarah thought that showed he had a sense of humour. He might even be rich. Money couldn't buy you love, could it? No, Sarah agreed, but it helped. Then she was off to collect the boys, asking to be kept in touch with any developments. Rosie was left alone to think. He'd given an address and phone number. Paul, he signed himself. Paul and Rosie. Rosie and Paul. If she'd thought writing the ad was difficult, Rosie got through so many sheets trying to draft a reply to Paul that she felt she'd better plant her own personal rainforest. It wasn't easy, this making the first move. There was only one thing for it. Phone him and do it now, before she lost her nerve. The longer the phone rang, the worse it got. Even if he did answer, she doubted she'd be able to speak.
Hello?
She couldn't do it. As soon as he said hello, she just panicked. Back to the drawing board. Well, writing pad. Come on, she told herself. You've been brave enough to place the ad. He's been brave enough to reply. Dear Paul, she wrote, the words coming naturally at last. Thanks for your reply to my advert. I was intrigued by your letter despite, or maybe because of the fact that you didn't send a photograph. Would you like to meet for a drink sometime? Perhaps you could suggest a nice country pub where a city girl can shake the dust off her feet. Please reply via the box number. Hope to hear from you. Box 88. Over the next few days, Rosie struck up an intimate relationship with her postman. Even in the shower, she could tell which was his tread up the path. She told herself she wasn't desperate for Paul to reply. So why did she feel so disappointed when the now familiar brown envelope forwarded on from the magazine was not among her post? Her horoscope was promising anyway. It didn't quite say, you are going to meet a tall, dark, handsome stranger, but surely the line about exploring any new opportunities had a certain relevance. Nothing doing. Rosie began to wonder if it was a conspiracy. Never before had she received so many letters urging her to reply within 10 days to win a set of encyclopedias. Never before had her bank manager, solicitous for her welfare, advised her to think about a new pension scheme. Rosie began to think she'd rather have no post at all than all these raised and dashed hopes. But then, an envelope from the magazine. No, she couldn't go out with anyone called Leslie, even if he did have a red setter. Perhaps this one would be from him. Or was she kidding herself? Silly, really, to set so much store by Paul. He just sounded so nice. By Saturday, she'd almost given up hope. Wasn't that the post? It won't be from him, she told herself, so don't get excited, okay? So why does she have that familiar sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach? was ridiculous. She couldn't live her life like this. She'd be a nervous wreck. So it's a blue envelope like his was last time. Just because her heart was beating faster, why did it make her fingers fumble? Had the blood supply stopped or something? So was it from Paul? Yes! Rosie felt all the tension of the past week ebb out of her. She knew she'd been right about him. She was still feeling pretty smug when Sarah called in that afternoon. She pretended she'd just called on the off chance, but Rosie knew perfectly well she was itching to know if there'd been any developments. Rosie's reward was in seeing her face as she scanned Paul's reply. But she was confused. Hadn't Rosie phoned? Rosie confessed that she tried, but chickened out when he answered and had written instead. Sarah had to agree that whatever the method, it had had the desired effect. Next Tuesday, driving a green Discovery, he'd be at a nearby pub. And she was impressed by his thoughtfulness. He suggested meeting in the car park so Rosie didn't have to sit in the pub on her own. Rosie agreed it was thoughtful of him. Roll on Tuesday. To say Rosie was nervous when Tuesday came would be the understatement of the century. Vainly, she tried to persuade Sarah that the whole thing had been a bad idea. Sarah was firm. They were going, and that was that. Rosie wasn't so easily convinced. It wasn't just that she was nervous about the actual meeting. She was frightened at just how much she was hoping things would work out. It wasn't that Sarah didn't feel for her friend. In fact, she thought she was incredibly brave. But she knew if she gave in to Rosie's fears now, she wouldn't be doing her a favour. Marie Antoinette on the way to the guillotine must have looked more cheerful than Rosie did. Sarah assumed an expression of unbridled cheerfulness, but Rosie turned to her, agonized. She still needed convincing. Sarah did her best to reassure her, promising that there was nothing to worry about. And they hadn't got time to start a debate. They'd be late. They don't have tumbrils anymore, but the modern family saloon can be a pretty good substitute on occasions. Rosie was just glad none of the neighbours were there to see her misery. She just didn't feel up to a jaunty wave at the moment. Sarah had hoped that once on the way, Rosie would relax, but her body language said it all. She was about as relaxed as someone with vertigo stuck at the top of a fairground ride in a power cut. Sarah's attempts to reassure her fell on stony ground. Rosie insisted she was fine. So why did she look as if she'd happily open the door and risk life and limb to jump out? Sarah just concentrated on driving, and after a while, Rosie did relax. She even managed to hold a reasonable conversation about Sarah's children without her voice coming out in a curious strangulated squeak. Then it happened. The green car, his green car, almost pushed them off the road. It was just too much for Rosie. She said she didn't care if that was him or not. She practically begged Sarah to turn around and head for home. She even threatened to get out and walk. It took all Sarah's negotiating skills, learnt the hard way with two toddlers, to talk her out of that one. And perhaps the threat that she'd put the central locking on. Even Rosie's jangled nerves couldn't fail to be soothed by Sarah's reassurance. Rosie began to perk up again, and they laughed about some of the would-be suitors they'd rejected. She even took an interest in the scenery. It was just the sort of picture postcard England which tourists yearn to find, but never do. You couldn't get coaches down these lanes. It had the lot. Green fields, grazing cows, the heavy, voluptuous smell of late summer. No one, not even Rosie in her current state, could have failed to be soothed. That changed as soon as they got to the pub. And the first thing they saw was a green car. Rosie immediately tried to shrink into invisibility. Sarah reasoned it couldn't be him, as he said he'd wait in the car and that one was empty. False alarm. She suggested they went round to the main car park. Once again, Rosie looked as if she could all but hear the roll of the drums, the swish of the guillotine blade, and the click of knitting needles. Oh no. Oh yes, this had to be him. Sarah took charge at once. I'll reverse into that space, she said. Just take deep breaths. You're going to be fine. Absolutely fine, I know it. Oh dear, that wasn't part of the plan. Rosie had never felt so exposed in all her life. She'd made it this far, but could she really see it through? Rosie hardly dared look. So this was Paul. No, it couldn't be. It was. Even Sarah looked horrified. And he was coming their way. Rosie and Sarah just froze. Neither could say a word. So was it or wasn't it him? There was hardly time for a sigh of relief before Rosie was saying, "That's it, I've had enough, let's go." And for once, Sarah had to agree with her. "Oh well," said Sarah as they drove off. "I suppose you can put it all down to experience." "I could put it all down to taking about 5 years off my life," retorted Rosie. Rosie knew one thing. She never wanted to see another green car in her life. But the evening's excitement wasn't over yet. It couldn't be. Could it? Paul? Rosie, it's him! The guy from the wine bar! You'd have thought Sarah had been in training for the RAC rally. She was obviously a different person behind the wheel of a car when the occasion called for it. Beside her, Rosie was almost hysterical with excitement. "It's him, it is! I know it is! Sarah, hurry up!" Whoops, that was close. It's not easy trying to argue with a tractor driver while your friend is gibbering that if she misses this chance, her life will be in ruins. Rosie was almost in tears. "He'll be gone! He won't wait! We must be, 20 minutes late now?" "Rosie," said Sarah firmly, "you have made your mind up that without Paul, your life is not going to be worth living. If you think I'm going to stand by and let him slip through your fingers, you're very much mistaken. We'll get there." Both were suffering a dreadful feeling of déjà vu by the time the pub came into view again. Rosie's guardian angel must have been working overtime that evening. The car was still there. Paul was still there. It wasn't quite the way she'd planned it, but Rosie was too relieved to care. "Are you Paul?" she gasped. His smile told her all she needed to know. Stumblingly, because her heart was again doing funny things, this time affecting her speech, Rosie mumbled some introductions. She could hear herself talking, but she couldn't tell if she was making any sense. She went on to explain their evening of misadventures and mistaken identity, how they'd nearly missed him, how ghastly it had been. He said he recognized them from the wine bar. Rosie affected a casualness she didn't feel and admitted they had been in a couple of times. She joked that she was trying to eat her way through his menu. "I've noticed," he grinned. "Last time, Sarah had the crab and you had the place." So he'd remembered. He was even more gorgeous than she remembered, she thought to herself. In fact, he was almost too good to be true. There was just one thing which was bothering her. She had to say something. Tentatively, she explained how she thought the blonde she'd seen him talking to in the wine bar that first evening must have been his girlfriend. Far from it. Apparently, she'd answered a lonely heart's ad but had been stood up. He'd just taken pity on her. That's what had given him the idea of looking at a Lonely Hearts column in the first place. That's why, he continued, he'd come up with the idea of meeting Rosie in the car park, thinking she'd hate to sit alone in a pub with everyone eyeing her and wondering what she was doing there. Rosie felt a warm glow of relief creep all down her spine. Sarah was as tactful as ever. Smilingly, she told Rosie to call her when she wanted a lift home, if she wanted a lift home. And she had words for Paul as well, telling him to make sure he sent a photograph next time. But he didn't think there'd be a next time. He smiled and caught Rosie's eye. And she never wanted to look away.